I'm Andrew Potter. I'm the program director for the McGill School of Public Policy, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here for our the McGill inaugural policy lecture for 2020-21. The speaker today is Professor Daniel Weinstock, who has recently received a new position. He's the Catherine A. Pearson Chair in Civil Society and Public Policy, cross-posted both the faculties of Law and Arts. And luckily for us, he's going to be teaching at the McGill School of Public Policy in the new year. He'll be teaching a complexity seminar. It is supposedly on topics, or apparently it's going to be on topics relating to his talk today. So he's giving you a bit of a dry run for a seminar next semester. I'll say this, I'm gonna turn it over to Professor Weinstock very quickly. The way this is gonna work, this is a Zoom meeting, right? It's not a webinar, so you'll be muted by the host. If you have any questions for Professor Weinstock, put them into the chat box. I'll be monitoring that, and I'll either call on you, or if it's a 5-part question with 2 sub amendments, I'll simply give a Coles Notes Professor Weinstock. But as we go along, he's going to talk for about 35 minutes or so, and put some questions in the chat box. So I'm not going to keep talking. I'm going to turn over to Professor Weinstock, who is giving us a talk on the very appropriate subject of all Zoom all the time: reflections on moving civil society online. Thank you. Professor Weinstock?
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here. And so thanks very much to McGill for having entrusted me with the inaugural lecture of the series this semester. It's inaugural, I'd say, in another sense as well, which is that this is really the first public event that I am speaking at as holder of that the talk that you're about to hear is programmatic. It sometimes means that they haven't really prepared anything, and so they're just going to be giving some sort of vague musings, and you can catch them out when they say this talk is going to be very programmatic. Sometimes, however, and I think this is the case, it's programmatic in the sense that it really is announcing a research program. About which I still don't have any definite answers, because it is in the nature of research programs that they raise questions, which over the years I hope to start having some answers to. So I'll be very, very keen to get your thoughts and comments on the research program. So as Andrew said, I am, since officially the month of June, the holder of the Catherine A. Pearson Chair in Civil Society and Public Policy. So I presented to the foundation, the committee that administers the chair, a research program, which I'll talk about a little bit. But then, obviously, as for a lot of things in the world, COVID happened and sort of upended some of the things that I had planned on doing. And so I want to tell you a little bit about what the chair is about, but also a little bit about how I want to think about the impact of COVID on the topic of the chair. Okay. So civil society and public policy. So for those of you who are a little bit older, you'll know that the concept of civil society had a little bit of a moment about 20 or 25 years ago. The great German social theorist Jürgen Habermas wrote a book on the public sphere, and some of his students and disciples started writing books and articles in which they thought, yeah, there's this thing called civil society that we really should be thinking more about. But that moment kind of never caught on more broadly amongst political philosophers. So I'm a political philosopher by training, despite the fact that I have moved around in departments and faculties a lot in my career. And I think it's true to say that still today, political philosophy, at least in the English-speaking world, is really about the state, is really about thinking about this strange entity called the state that wields sovereign power over its citizens, and the questions, whether implicitly or explicitly, that political philosophers ask is, what should the state be doing with that sovereign power, right? What goods can it achieve by having power, by having the monopoly of legitimate violence, to use Max Weber's phrase, over its citizens? And conversely, what are the limits that we should impose on what is a fairly awesome power, right? A power ultimately over the life of its citizens. So political philosophy has been philosophy about the state, and it's been about the state in a fairly institutionally unspecific way. The state is often represented as a kind of monolithic entity. And I think political philosophers have been lacking in their fine-grained attention to the institutions through which the power of the state is deployed, and also the nature of the entities upon which that power is deployed. And I think that one of these lacuna has to do with the institutions of civil society. Civil society is present as a shadow in the writing of a lot of political philosophers, insofar as they think about, well, what are the limits of the power that the state should exercise over, for example, religious groups or over educational institutions. But it's also always kind of a shadow. One infers what these institutions are by sort of interpreting what political philosophers think that the state should or shouldn't do to them. So part of the program of the chair, as I wrote it back in February, is that right? Yeah, I think that was right, January or February, was to think about the relationship between the state and civil society in a slightly more institutionally grounded way, thinking about what the goods are, what the purposes are that institutions of civil society perform. Okay, so that's sort of like a 32,000 feet in the air description of what my intention for the chair was. Now let's start coming down a little bit lower and looking at the landscape with a little bit more resolution. So the term civil society obviously is not a foreign one to a lot of people. If I say the word civil society, people will have images or concepts or particular kinds of institutions that they will think of. So I want to give you a little bit of a potted history of the way in which civil society has been thought of by political philosophers of previous generations, because though, as I've claimed, political theorists and political philosophers have perhaps not thought about civil society as much as they should, that's certainly not true of political philosophers and political theorists of previous generations. Indeed, for thinkers as different as Hegel, the great German philosopher, or Alexis de Tocqueville, the great French observer of the nascent American democracy, civil society was really quite a big deal. So what is a civil society? So civil society is often described at a first approximation by using a spatial metaphor. So the idea is that civil society are all of those institutions that kind of lie between, so there's the spatial metaphor, between individuals taken singly and the state. So there is a rich tapestry in well-functioning liberal democracies of institutions that are neither just a bunch of individuals getting together in a kind of episodic way, nor are they institutions of the state, and they form the life of well-functioning liberal democracies to a significant degree. So if I had to sort of put on my philosopher's hat now and sort of identify some necessary and sufficient conditions for the concept of civil society to apply, I would put in, I would say at least the three following things would need to be the case. There are associations. They bring together numbers of people. They are perhaps not permanent, but they aim to a certain kind of permanency. They are spread out in time. A bunch of friends or a bunch of people going to the park to play a pickup game of baseball or football is not a civil society institution. If they were to play in a league, well, that would be, because again, the idea is that the league pretends to transcend the participation of any given individual or set of individuals within the institution. Even if I give up playing next year, the league will still be around. So we have association of people, we have a certain relative permanence, and we have a certain rule governedness, right? There are rules that structure associations, rules about what to do, what not to do, rules about the goals that are pursued by the institution, rules about governance of the institution. So where you have these three things outside of the purview of the state, well, you have a civil society organization. And so you can see that the range of civil society is really quite broad, potentially, and will encompass things as homely and small scale as community organizations, as the football league or the baseball league that I described a minute ago, and also corporations, large global corporations. Amazon or Netflix are part of global civil society. So it's a very capacious concept, and it's one that I'm going to break down a little bit further on in the talk. Okay, now civil society, for the people who have written about it, usually in a positive mood with positive valence. So I talked about Hegel, I talked about de Tocqueville, we could throw in other names like Hannah Arendt, like Jürgen Habermas, social theorists, sociologists who have looked at the civil society have usually thought of it as being a good thing. They have noted, and in this they are not wrong, that when authoritarian governments come to power, one of the first things that they do is assault civil society institutions, because authoritarian governments work best when there is, as it were, an unmediated relationship between the state on the one hand and individuals on the other. Anything that buffers that relationship, anything that gives the individual sort of rival allegiances to the state is seen by authoritarians as suspect. And so it's no surprise that one of the first targets of authoritarian or proto-totalitarian governments when they come to power is that they launch assaults on unions, on independent media, on educational institutions, universities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These are threatening to any form of power that seeks to achieve a kind of an unmediated authority over individuals. So what are the goods that, civil society institutions are seen as achieving when they function well? Well, as one goes through this sort of literature that goes back all the way to the 18th century and into the 20th century, I think there are 5 general categories of goods, of purposes that civil society organizations have been seen by those who've studied them as fulfilling. So as I get older and my memory starts going, whenever I say that there are 5, you can be sure that I'll only remember 4 if I don't look at my notes. So I will now look down at my notes and so that I don't forget any of them. So the first good is obviously that they are good for individuals, right? Individuals who live in a society that has a flourishing tapestry of civil society organizations are better able to thrive. Those of you who have done a little bit of political philosophy know that there's this term out there called conceptions of the good. What is a good society? A society is one that allows individuals to develop and to try to deploy an individual freely arrived at conception of the good. Well, if you have a conception of the good and no civil society institutions through which to try to exercise them, you're probably not going to be able to do very much with your conception of the good. So a rich civil society is in the first instance good for the people who are part of society because it provides them with vehicles through which they can implement and give reality to their conceptions of the good. In a way, it's also good for the state, in a sense. Now, I talked about the fact that authoritarians don't like civil society institutions because they kind of divert identification and allegiance from them. But well-functioning states, liberal democracies, tend to look a little bit more positively at civil society organizations because civil society organizations perform functions which, in virtue of performing them, the state no longer has to take care of itself. So if you talk to people in Quebec education, for example, and you ask them, why is it the case that Quebec still has this, private schools are still very much a thing in Quebec, and they are, these private schools, often sort of grounded in either ethnocultural or religious sort of organizations, right? If you ask them, why should we just have state schools for everybody? They say, well, basically, we get more supply of the educational good that we would otherwise be in sort of short supply of if we allow these groups to provide, under certain conditions, of course, education as an option for families in Quebec. So the idea here, again, and you could multiply it across a range of other kinds of goods, is that civil society just produces surplus or produces additional types of goods that the state should be supplying to its citizens, but sometimes just doesn't have the wherewithal to do to a sufficient degree. And so civil society can come in and fill the gaps. And second, it can do so in a kind of a contextually appropriate way. Going back to the example of education, though one could, of course, contest the idea that education should be delivered to children in too contextually specific a way, in ways that are too sensitive to their religious or ethnocultural or linguistic identities, there's still something about local knowledge that inheres in sort of communities that allows them perhaps to deliver certain goods in a more contextually appropriate way. So that's the second. So the first one is good for individuals, and it's also, under the right sets of circumstances, good for the state. Alexis de Tocqueville, the great observer of American democracy as it was getting off its feet in the 19th century, came to America and noted the flourishing array of associational life that went on in the United States of the 19th century. And he admired the energy with which Americans devoted themselves to their institutions of civil society, be it their churches or guilds or whatever. He called them, he had this wonderful phrase, which I think points to a third sort of virtue or function that civil society organizations have been seen as performing, which is that they are, and here I'm using his expression, schools for democracy, right? When people have to get together in order to govern, in order to administer public good of a small scale, well, that that educates them both in sort of concrete skills, but also perhaps in sorts of dispositions that are needed in order to be a good democratic citizen of the society as a whole. So that kind of makes sense, right? If you have to make a budget for your, let's use the example that I've been trundling through this talk so far, a baseball league, well, that might make you a little bit more likely to understand what goes on in making a budget for a larger entity like a province or a state. But perhaps more importantly, Tocqueville thought that when you have to get together with other people who you don't necessarily know, who you wouldn't necessarily associate with through your family life or perhaps through your work, you develop a certain number of aptitudes of character, traits of character that dispose you to being a good democratic citizen. You have to compromise. You have to learn how to talk to people that you're not used to talking to, because if not, you just won't get from A to B in the life of your organization. And these are all things, these practical skills and these sort of traits of character are both, Tocqueville said, things that are good for democratic citizens to have. And it's easier for them to acquire these skills in the sort of smaller scale of civil society organizations than being thrown into larger institutions of democratic governance without this sort of prior training. So that's number three. Number four, and these are in no particular logical sequence or order, is the idea which I referred to before, which is that civil society is part of a complex architecture in well-functioning modern liberal democracies through which the power of the state is tempered, right? So if you take a constitutional theory class or a political science class and you hear about the division of powers, well, you'll hear about the importance of having a constitutionalized division of power between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary. less often discussed is the idea that even these institutions within the government need to be balanced, need to be provided with bulwarks or contre-pouvoirs that stem from outside of government. And the idea is that the institutions of civil society can perform the function of balancing the otherwise perhaps overweening power that states might try to exercise on their citizens. So again, these are all truisms, but sometimes truisms are worth repeating and reminding people of. A free press, a free associational life, community organizations, organizations that fight for the rights of different groups that are disadvantaged or disenfranchised, are all part of the complex system of checks and balances that make functioning liberal democracy function well. So that's number 4. Number 5, and this is the last one that I'll mention, is that, so at the same time as people talked a lot about civil society back in perhaps the 80s and 90s, there was this other set of concepts which also sort of bubbled into a little bit of the political philosophy literature, and then kind of didn't get talked about all that much, although it's still a very important concept in other branches of social theory, is the idea of social capital or social trust, right? The idea is that at a very concrete level, societies function better when, and they function more economically when they can rely on a fund of trust amongst citizens. If anybody has ever been to low trust society, I spent a couple of summers teaching in Guatemala, which at the time that I was there, and unfortunately I think still today, counts as a society that is at the lower reaches of trust. You realize just how much, at a very concrete level, money is spent in order to protect oneself against people who are seen as not trustworthy, as out to get me. Any shop that has anything of any value in it will be protected by somebody with a weapon. And that person presumably has to be paid, and that pay detracts from the profits which the business can reap. So at a very concrete level, there's something about social trust that makes them less efficient. But at a more perhaps ethereal level, social trust and social capital means that people are more willing, right, to get into undertakings with to get into sort of entrepreneurial, perhaps, undertakings with others, where they have to, as it were, at least in the first instance, entrust part of their interests to other people. And again, in the same way as people like Tocqueville thought that being part of civil society organizations meant that you learn to be a good democratic citizen by learning how to compromise, by learning how to administer a shared good. In the same way, the idea is that being a part of civil society and doing things with fellow citizens that are part of what civil society organizations do will lead to a more positive view of one's fellow citizen, greater amount of trust, greater amount of social capital, and something that the entire society will benefit from in at least the 2 ways that I've mentioned. Okay, so civil society, these sort of intermediate institutions that are, collectives that serve some kind of a purpose, that are rule-bound and that aim to a certain amount of permanence, and they serve a certain number of goods. Now, of course, civil society organizations also have potentially dark sides to the extent that they have authority structures, right? And many civil society organizations do have their own authority structures. Well, they are subject to all of the vicissitudes and problems that any authority structure is subject to. Abuse of authority, and abuse of authority which is harder to check than the authority of the state, because it, first of all, occurs in many ways that are sometimes less visible than the authority that is wielded by the state. And very often civil society organizations will claim a certain kind of independence from the state, which will also mean an independence from the kinds of protections that the state affords its citizens normally. So potential dark side in the fact that a lot of civil society organizations have authority structures, and also dark sides in the sense that although civil society organizations are supposed to deliver goods to their citizens, they do so in a kind of pell-mell and unsystematic manner, right? There's no guarantee that just allowing the hidden hand of the market of civil society to sort of take hold will mean that everybody will have their interests well taken care of. And so there's a need for space within the state for civil society organizations, but also a need for a kind of regulatory, for regulation as well. So I've just described the project of the chair that I proposed to the committee that oversaw the competition for the chair, and that's what I was going to be doing for the next 7 years, sort of running through what I take to be the main organizations in civil society and think about ways in which their interaction with the state could be thought of with the tools of political philosophy and legal theory, could be thought of in ways that gave greater weight, not just to the dark side, but also to the positive sort of aspects of civil society organizations that are sometimes not given as much place or space as one would want. But then COVID happened. And changed everything, and in particular changed everything for most civil society organizations. And it seemed like it would be sort of a kind of almost caricatured academic abstraction to launch the work of the chair in ways that didn't take into account the ways in which COVID, the pandemic that we are in the midst of, is changing everything, and in particular, changing the way in which civil society organizations and associations work, but also, in virtue of those changes, the way in which they are capable of fulfilling the functions in a well-functioning liberal democracy that I talked about just a moment ago. So this is the part of the talk that actually, oh my, I've already been talking for 20, yeah, okay, so I'll have to go a little bit quicker. I'm making an assumption here, which unfortunately I think is an assumption that is not hugely sort of crazy, which is that we are in this for a while. We are not going to be lifted from our travails by December, even though Donald Trump, is hoping that he'll be able to announce a day before the election that vaccine has been approved for use. I think that we are years probably from being in a situation in which a vaccine has been developed, manufactured, and distributed and administered in sufficiently widely to say that we are essentially out of the situation of moderate to high risk that we find ourselves in right now. I think that we have to think about this not as something that is going to transform society forever, but something that is going to transform it for long enough that it is worth thinking about the impacts and costs, maybe some benefits, but mostly costs of the transformation that COVID is wreaking. So what are the changes that COVID has wrought all across civil society? Well, and here's the title of the talk. As I was setting up a series of webinars, which the chair is going to be holding over the course of the year. One of the things that I thought it would be interesting to have people from different religious organizations talk about the way in which COVID has changed their practice, but also the way that they see their role vis-a-vis their members. A person who for who these words coming out of their mouth sounded very strange, said to me, well, what do you want? Right now, it's all Zoom all the time, baby. And so the question that I want to ask myself, at least this year, perhaps for the next couple of years, is how does moving civil society online affect the capacity of civil society organizations to fulfill the functions which generations and centuries of social theorists have set for it? So that is the very definition of a programmatic question. And the answer is 6 months into this crisis, almost day for day, right? We all went under on March 13th, and we are now September 17th, I think, so 6 months. We still don't know exactly, but there are a few hunches and hypotheses that I'd like to follow up, and I just want to share a few with you in maybe the next 10 minutes so that we could have time for questions. The first thing I want to point out, and this is by way of sort of prolegomenon, is that it's not just the zoomification of society and the zoomification of civil society that is affecting this fragile equilibrium that I talked about a moment ago between different kinds of institutions in civil society. We are living through a situation, both in relatively well-functioning liberal democracies like here, and in places that have already sort of become problematic in terms of their liberal democratic pedigree, in which the executives of these societies have taken on extraordinary powers. Right? We are living in Quebec under a public health emergency. We have been for the last 6 months, which allows the executive to take decisions by decree. Therefore, the role of Parliament, of the legislature in this equilibrium has been downplayed considerably. And so we've had numerous decrees in Quebec and indeed in Montreal over what we can and can't do. Decisions that in ways which are probably justifiable in the context of the pandemic, but still require a kind of vigilance, have limited freedom of religion, freedom of movement, all the basic freedoms that we more or less take for granted have been limited by decree without much of a pushback from legislatures. So again, you might see this as entirely justifiable. That's not the point that I want to make, but just to say that as a matter of empirical description, the balance has already tilted considerably towards the executive, at least in the short term. So that's the first point that I want to make. Let me just take a second to see where I am and see what I can skip through. Okay, so one of the hypotheses that I want to pursue is one that I haven't talked about at all thus far. So remember that I said that the set of institutions that are encompassed by my definition, which I won't repeat, is very large and capacious and includes everything from neighborhood organizations all the way to corporations and NGOs and global NGOs and what have you. Now, I think if you were to do a kind of a sort of ask the population what they hear when they hear the word civil society, they'd be thinking about something fairly grassroots and small scale. They'd be thinking more at the sort of neighborhood organization end of the spectrum than at the global institution part of the spectrum, and for good reason. There are institutions that are at the global institution part of the spectrum that are starting to look and act almost like states, and so it's quite understandable that people may exclude them from the ambit of their understanding of civil society. But there's something else, I think, about, and this is just a hypothesis that I'm making. I'd love to hear from people about what they think of this. I think that to use a philosopher's term, the sort of folk concept, the idea that people have spontaneously when they think about civil society, is one that encompasses some aspect of embodiedness, of face-to-facedness, right? The idea that these organizations are places that don't just serve functions, but they are places that serve functions in virtue and by people coming together in the same space at the same time, in physical presence of one another. And one of the questions which I think we have no idea about right now, but I think it's a worthwhile thing to think about and to research, is to what degree do some of the positive purposes that I pointed to above, especially things to do with the establishment of social trust, with the development of democratic mores and traits of character, of people's ability to lead thriving lives in liberal democracies, to what degree do they depend on something that we never really thematized and brought to into explicit phrasing because it was such a taken for granted part of the background in which we live our lives? To what degree, therefore, do all of these functions depend upon institutions being ones that people participate in a face-to-face manner, without some of the constraints that are posed by meetings like this one, by meetings like the ones that we are having right now. So I really want to stop in about 5 minutes, throw out a number of sort of leads that I'd like to sort of point to. Some of them that sort of lead in the direction of thinking that perhaps the Zoomification of civil society really is just a terrible thing from the point of view of civil society's capacity to do the things that I described above, and some perhaps a little bit more hopeful. So I want to say, so these are going to be completely disconnected kind of hypotheses, and I think that they are all worthy of sort of, verification by empirical inquiry and by talking to the relevant people in these organizations. So I'll begin with the deliberative function of a lot of these civil society organizations. So I'll remind you of the point that Tocqueville made, schools for democracy, right? People get together and debate and discuss, compromise, develop dispositions and traits of character through which they are perhaps more disposed to compromise, see the other side that they would otherwise be. Now, people like Cass Sunstein and others, well before COVID got underway, had sort of already gotten us used to the idea that online life is not particularly conducive to compromise. Social media tend to create bubbles of like-minded people who don't really reach across any particular ideological aisle, but who just find themselves amongst themselves, deliberating in a bit of a vacuum. To what degree has the Zoomification of society sort of augmented what was already present and evident in pre-COVID online times? A second point related to this is there, are there inherent limits with the format that we find ourselves in to achieve these sort of democratic goals that Tocqueville and others talked about? Those of us who've spent a lot of time on Zoom, those of us who've attended both meetings and taught and done a lot of these things on Zoom have come to realize that there are many things that, again, we take for granted and never really think about when we are in a classroom or when we're in a meeting, which are actually quite important. We read people's cues. I am right now speaking to a computer screen. I can see myself. I can see some names up at the top. If I were giving a lecture, I would be sort of sensitive to the non-verbal rather cues that you'd be giving out. People are starting to yawn, people are starting to get bored, or on the contrary, people are really sort of hooking on to this point. I don't have that right now. Now, it doesn't matter. This is a very monological, one-directional process right now. I'm giving a lecture to you. But the lack of those sort of cues that I think are part of the socialization into democracy that Tocqueville talked about, their lack becomes much more important when we're trying to do something different from just having a lecture, when we're trying to have a meeting and come to a decision about something that is perhaps contested or controversial. So with respect to the sort of democratic function, we can perhaps see how some of the hardwired concrete aspects of the forms that we have sort of been forced into, Zoom and all of its cousins, may have some liabilities when it comes to developing these aptitudes. Think about the function which has to do with the building of trust. I have always thought that there's something very interesting, something that political philosophers should perhaps be more interested in the way in which different societies, different groups are more or less successful in negotiating spatial organization when they are thrown into a situation where many people have to share space together. So one of the things that's often been observed to me by friends and colleagues who come to Montreal and attend large-scale events like the Jazz Festival is how well organized it seems. There are tons of stages, there are tons of people milling about, and yet people seem to go to where they're supposed to be going in ways that involve millions and millions of micro decisions about how to negotiate the space that one is in relative to others. And it all seems to work. It certainly never descends into violence, and it seems to work quite well. I think that there's work that should be done to a greater degree than has been done so far in the way in which successful negotiation of the myriad spatial contexts in which we find ourselves through sometimes things like attending cultural institutions, attending performing arts, not at all the function of a performing art sort of venue to educate us in the way of sharing space with others. And yet, I would argue, it does. And it's something that bears studying. And it's something the absence of which may lead to sort of deficit in our ability to develop the sort of trusting dispositions that people like Tocqueville thought that civil society would give rise to. I'm going to give one last example, and then I'll close it down so that we have a little bit of time for questions. One of the things that I think we need to study to a greater degree is the way in which the positive functions of civil society that I described before are served by civil society organizations by indirection. What do I mean by that? Well, take a university. When COVID struck and we realized that we were going to have to move the university online, the immediate thought that we all had, and I don't, at all criticize administrators for having had this thought before any of them, is, well, how will we do the core business of the university online, where the core business is just delivering content, delivering lectures, right? What if one of the purposes of universities and one of the things that allows universities to perform their functions with respect to the goals that I described above has to do with things that aren't really considered, if one looks at the org chart of a university, as core business. The things that happen before and after the lecture in the hallways, the things that happen when people are brought together in the sort of less structured environments that a university nonetheless makes possible. I think that there are positive aspects to the Zoomification of our civil society life as well. I can be at a lecture or give a lecture in Hong Kong without moving from my messy study, which is something that I did yesterday. There are accessibility issues. A lot of our spaces and universities are not particularly good at this, are difficult to access for people with some mobility limitations. So there are some good things about the Zoomification of everything, the Zoomification of civil society, accessibility, and the ability to reach across geographical expanses which are probably impossible in other circumstances might be one of them. But I think it would be worth thinking about the functions which civil society organizations are meant to pursue, to think about ways in which the taken for granted in other circumstances embodied nature of these civil society institutions has an irreducible place in generating some of the goods that I talked about, that will therefore be very difficult to replicate on platforms such as this, unless we really give it more thought than we have done so far. So I'll end there, and thank you all very much.